Welcome to another edition of Recruiter Fuel. My name's Steve Lois. I am your host. You know, I've been recruiting for 28, almost 29 years now. And the more I learn about recruiting, the more I realize there's more to learn about recruiting. There's always some new approach. There's always something we can get better at. But one of the other things that I've realized is that we often forget what we learned early on in our careers, and it really hasn't had a huge negative impact on us, but we sometimes need to go back to the basics. So the thing I wanted to cover today is this idea of the intake session, right? This is what sets the tone for the entire search. If we don't get this part right, when we sit down with the hiring leader to really determine what should we be doing, if we get this part wrong, we know that things can go awry. Now, a lot of people think about this as right or wrong in terms of intake. I want to talk about odds, right? So think about it this way. Let's say you're sitting on an airplane, and I'm here in Metro Detroit, so I'm at DTW, and I'm sitting on an airplane, and I'm going to fly to Seattle. And the pilot puts in the destination, knows exactly where we're going to go, Seattle. But unfortunately, starting in Detroit is 1 degree off in terms of programming in the system the direction that he wants to go in or she wants to go in. Now let's think about it. As we go through the process, we go through the flight, and we end up on the other side of the country heading to Seattle. But we started off just a little bit off from what we're looking for. What happens when we travel all the way across? Well, we're not anywhere near Seattle. In fact, that 1 degree difference may end up putting us somewhere in Southern California. So we can really get things wrong, even if that intake is just feeling a little bit off. Now, let's do a comparison. And I know it's a little bit of a stretch, but I want to do this comparison anyways, using the example I just shared with you. Let's think about the recruiting process, right? We need to know where we're going. We need to know the expectations the hiring leader has of the candidate in terms of exactly what do they have to produce. What's the results they're looking for? It's the same thing. We got to know we're going to Seattle. So that's number one. Number two, though, and this is something that pilots do all the time, they accommodate the changing winds, right? They have to continue to course correct. They need to know more about what's happening. And in recruiting in the intake session, it's the same thing. Not only do we need to know what we need to find in terms of the results the candidate needs to produce, but where's the wind blowing within the organization? And how does that affect the type of candidate we actually need? I'll explain that here in a second. And then the third thing is, you know, the pilot determines based on where they're going, based on the winds and the impact, exactly how much fuel they need. Now think of the fuel as the skills of the candidate. That's the direction we need to go. Where are we going? What's in our way of getting there, or what do we need to do to adjust? And then let's look at the gas or the skills. But what do we often do in a traditional intake session? We focus on the candidate without really understanding the results or understanding the effects of the winds that are coming in with the organization. I mean, let's take a step back here. What's really the purpose of an intake session? And if you watched last week's episode or the previous episode, and if you haven't, make sure you go back to that, because we started to talk about influence. How do we create influence with our hiring leaders? The intake session is an extension of that. We continue to build influence with our hiring leaders by doing the intakes the right way and uncovering what they really need. And then the second piece is absolutely understanding what's the right profile of the candidate. What does the candidate actually need to accomplish? So that's really what we're looking for. But what I call the recruiter funk is that we often get into the basic questions, right? It's what skills do you need? Okay, it's in itself, it's not a bad question. What's the must-haves? What's the like-to-haves? You know, these are common things that we've all been taught, we've all taught others. And individually, none of these questions are bad, but think about what we're doing again. We're focusing on how much fuel we have in the tank before we really know where we're going and how the winds affect how much fuel we actually need. So we've got to approach this idea of the intake from different angles. So I want to address number one is this idea of the wind blowing. What's going on within the organization and how does that affect what we're really looking for in terms of the candidate? So let me paint a picture for you. Job description for a controller. We're looking for a basic controller for company A. You may be doing this right now yourself. Let's say I've been in a situation where I filled a ton of different controller roles. Same position, it's the same thing over and over and over. So I'm going to go find it again. I forget to ask the questions about what's really going on. What we need to understand is what's happening. Where's the wind blowing within the organization? Because it starts to paint a different picture. Let me just give you a couple of examples of what I mean by the wind blowing. Let's say the organization is in what I call startup mode. There's not a lot of rules. It's kind of everybody's doing things very quickly. The type of controller that fits that bill, same job description, is very different from, let's say, the next level up. Not startup, but let's say the company is in scale-up mode. The wind is blowing in a different direction. Now it's about, hey, we're scaling up. Maybe we got some private equity funding. We've got to have some accounting rules and structure and so on. So it's potentially a different-looking candidate from startup to scale-up. Now let's go a step further. What if the company is really in what I call grown-up mode, or the division is in what I call grown-up mode, right? It's not about reinventing everything. It's not about, hey, we're starting. It's not about we need to create rules. We have rules. What we're now focused on is creating efficiencies. That's a very different profile, same exact job description. Beyond this idea of grown-up, there's what I call blow-up. We just need to restart and do everything over again within accounting, within our controllership responsibility. That, again, is a completely different profile. And then the last stage that we often see in organizations or in departments is what I call roll-up. We're going to sell the business. We're going to sell the division, what have you. My point in all of this is the wind is blowing, and it changes the profile of the candidate, although the job description looks exactly the same. Are we uncovering, when we're doing the intake, which way the wind is blowing? Unfortunately, sometimes our hiring leaders don't think about it in those terms. They look at the job description and we talk about it. These are the skills we need, and not understanding which way the wind is blowing in the first place. So that's kind of step number one. Step number two is really the destination. Let's think about, again, the common intake I mentioned earlier. We talk about what skills do we need. We talk about what's our desires, what's our must-haves, do we need a degree, all of that stuff. And it's all good questions. But what are we missing? What's the result? What do we need this person to do? Let's start there first. Let's start with the results of the position, because often we just make the assumption about the results are, instead of getting our hiring leader to be very clear. The results are, we need somebody who can come in and increase our revenue by 15% in the next 12 months. That is a very specific result. But do we think about that? Do we ask that question around most of our positions? Even after 28 years, I sometimes get caught in the funk of just going right into the job description, the skills, and so on. And I forget to think about the way the wind is shifting, and I really don't focus on results first. I get into skills, which we do very well. Now, there's a whole lot more to this idea of focusing on results first. I would encourage you to do this. Go to www.recruitmentedu.com, register a free account, but then take a look at the results-based interviewing course, which starts with the intake. What's the steps to go through to determine really the results, why those results are important, how those results need to be achieved, what are the obstacles in the way of achieving those results? It will change your intake game by just starting with the end in mind. Also, if you use this discount code, RecruiterFuelRBI, again, RecruiterFuelRBI, all capital letters, you'll get 25% off that specific course. So the intake session is important. We need to adjust for the wind. We need to start focusing on results first in that intake session. It helps build our credibility and truly understand what's going on So we're not veering off track when we're flying from point A to point Z. We're actually staying on track and continuing to adjust to keep us there. I hope, again, this was helpful for you. If you're watching this video right now, make sure you click your notification icon wherever it is so that you're notified of every single new episode we put out. And again, if you have a challenge, if you have a question, or if you have some advice, please reach out to me directly. I may ask you to come on to the program so that you can share your wisdom with the broader recruiting community. Remember, Recruiter Fuel is all about community, a community of professional recruiters whose focus is on helping each other, whose focus is on elevating the recruiting industry, and then collectively improving our results for all of the companies that we support. Thanks for joining. We'll see you at the next episode.